Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar on the opportunities and challenges of working with agents and distributors overseas. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I am the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's only professional membership body for traders, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session, and you can ask questions at any point during the webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. We have two great speakers today, with John Reed from Export Aid and the Institute of Export giving some practical advice about managing and forming of relationships with agents and distributors overseas. We'll then have Liz Ward from Virtuoso Legal giving some legal advice and tips to ensure you manage the various risks involved. But to kick things off, over to you, John.
Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for attending this seminar. If you can move on to the next slide, please. This just summarizes why I'm justified in talking to you about this particular subject. I've effectively managed agents, distributors, and other selling partners around the world for about 35 years. And for the last 13, 14, 15 even, I've been running my own company, advising companies on how to do that. Next slide. The key to working with agents and distributors is really to follow 7 fundamental steps. And a lot of this is preparatory. It's really important, though, that when you're looking at appointing agents, distributors, any other selling partners, that you just should see that as part of a process and not as an individual isolated event. If you don't have a strong international strategy, then you won't know, for example, how many agents that you need to appoint in different markets, what the geographical spread of agents is across the world, which ones can interact with each other, which ones are going to be separate, how you're going to segment your markets, and a whole range of other issues. But these 7 fundamentals I'll take you through right now. Can you take me on to the next slide, please? This is what I mean by looking at an international sales strategy. On the left-hand side there are market strategies, on the right-hand side are product strategies. That is basically asking you the question, well, are you going to sell all products to all markets? Are you going to concentrate on a few markets at a time? Are you going to trial your products in a single city? Are you going to attempt to satellite market, for example, Colombia in South America, with a view to getting the name known in South America for the rest of the continent? Because that does happen. If you pick a good, successful market and you're successful in that market, then adjacent markets want your product or service. If you look at the product side, are you going to limit the number of your products like Apple have done with their iPhones until recently? Or are you going to go for every single product in your range? These are things that you need to decide before you make your offer to the market. Next slide, please. In terms of how you do it, then you've got a whole range of different options for you. And within those, on the left-hand side, 4th one down, you'll see sales agent, 6th one down, you'll see distributor. But there are many other ways of approaching an international market. Sometimes you can use more than one at a time. For example, I worked with a distributor in Germany who had 14 sales agents that covered the whole country for him. So that worked because I was working through his sales agents. In other markets, as you'll see later, I've appointed a separate sales agent to cover a territory that the distributor in France didn't cover. On the right-hand side, you've got some of the issues that can come from each of those points on the left-hand side. For example, direct sales right up there at the top, it's going to cost you. Have you got the resource to do it? Have you got the people to do it who can sell into the local market? In some cases, that will be a no-brainer, an easy thing to do. But in others, you need to rely on some kind of selling partners or halfway house towards setting up your own office in that country. Moving on. So if you're looking at an individual market, let's take a step back and just think about what you need for that market. You're not going to establish that without research. And one thing that you could possibly do is take a look at what your competitors do. If your competitors operate entirely through one distributor, leaving other distributors open for approach, then that could be great. Or it might be that that distributor has the entire market sewn up. But the fact remains that there is always a way to break into a market if your product is good enough, if it's a product that the market wants, which you will of course have researched, and if there's a credible local presence that will enable you to access that market in more than just a sort of peripheral way. So you look at down the left-hand side there. Are you going to go for a single selling partner, or are you going to mix and match it like I did in Germany with the distributor in the north and the 14 sales agents? Can you separate the responsibilities of your various selling partners by either product, distinguishing them by product, or by market segment, or by territory within the market? Market segmentation is a good way of dividing responsibilities, because it's very clear. If you have, as I do, a client who sells into markets of the Middle East, and they sell their products into the healthcare sector, into sports and leisure, and into the hotel and food. They're three very distinct sub-markets that there isn't much crossover between. So you can have one sales agent or distributor for each of those things. It works quite neatly. There is no one-size-fits-all rule. So if anybody thinks that, forget it. It's not the case. You will find that moving from Holland to Belgium, you'll find different things just over the border within a European country. And so you have to take each market on its merits, not just in terms of product segmentation, in terms sometimes of legal approach, in terms of logistics, and a whole range of different things. On the right-hand side there, I've listed a couple of things about a distributor. A distributor, to me, is somebody who distributes goods. So you sell your goods to the distributor, they sell them into the local market. The best distributors, in my experience, and bearing in mind it is only my experience, I may have 35 years experience of doing this, but there's still an awful lot that I have to learn. But my experience is that a single distributor, or any distributor with their own employees, is often a better option, because the distributor, as the employer, will invest in their own employees to ensure that the correct training is given, that gets the products out there into the market, into the customers, and it's very sales-led. Distributors who operate with sales agents have varying degrees of success. Some of it can be fantastically successful, like my guy was in Germany. But sometimes, because of the way sales agents operate, they like to work with a basket of products, and the ones that make them the most money are the ones they're going to go with. So irrespective of whether they're controlled directly from your company or from a distributor, the fact remains is that they're going to focus on what makes them the most money. Next slide, please. It is important within your review, and I'd urge everybody whatever level you're at, to have a complete review every year of all of your routes to market, the performance of every single one of your selling partners. Because that way, first of all, you instill the idea that a review is really important, both within your company and also any new sales agent or distributor. Part of the process of bringing them on board is to tell them every year there is going to be a review. Then it will be expected. It's a soft way of telling them that their performance is going to be watched, because you only want good performing selling partners. Don't expect quick results in some markets. It's not going to happen that way. Yeah, we know some companies get lucky and they get big orders in the first few months, but that doesn't always happen. It's why you have to have a 5-year plan which enables you to break into markets at different rates, because all markets run at different speeds. So when somebody doesn't come back with the figures you're expecting of them, you give them a forecast of 100,000 in the first year and they come back with 20,000. The answer may not be all bad. The answer may be that they got the first 20,000 of business, but the work they've done during that first year will lead to a lot more in the second year. So don't believe the black and white. That's not the only issue. Look at the market conditions, because if there's an election, for example, that can stop all public sector projects for 6 months and more. So it may not be down to the fault or the ability of your selling partner. Always keep a lookout for alternative selling partners, the competition to your selling partners, irrespective of how good or bad they may be. It really is important to let your partners know that you're always looking in the market. It keeps them on their toes. And take a look, as I said earlier, at how your competitors sell. There may be a better way than you know. With all that in place, whichever route to market you choose, it's vital that you support it. You're going to have to put some budget behind this. Next slide, please. Just taking a look at what I said in the last slide. These are a list of questions. It's not an exhaustive, definitive list, but just take a look at those for a few seconds. Put the boot on the other foot. Imagine yourself in the position of a sales agent or distributor, and then think what you would want out of the deal. That way, you start to understand what their push and pull points are. Next slide, please. Looking at the alternative selling partners, the questions are there for you. You'll have your own, because every company has their own specific questions that are based on their products, their experience of different markets and so on. But there you've got, are there any alternative selling partners? What are the competitors' selling methods? It's quite important to be aware of all of this, but then down at the bottom again, how are you going to support the market when you do approach, or wait, sorry, when you do appoint a selling partner? Next slide. One of the things that is often missed is that you can try and find a distributor in a market and they may not exist because the tradition of that market may be that everything's done really through a network of sales agents. The whole of the European Union Commercial Agents Directive of 1986 is based on the two strongest countries in the European Union, Germany and France, where the tradition has generally been over many, many centuries to sell through a network of sales agents. There are, of course, distributors in those markets now. There are many distributors, but that is the tradition on which the Commercial Agents Directive was built. In Southeast Asia, you'll find that, yes, again, there are distributors, but behind those distributors, between them and your customer, the end user of your product, there may be a chain of multiple family members, each taking a small, minuscule percentage for making a deal happen. Every market, every region has its differences, and you need to know what they are, because that way, when you do appoint somebody to represent you. You're appointing somebody who is close to the market in cultural terms, as well as in being able to sell your product. Back to the one size doesn't fit all argument. It really is important to take this on board because there are different languages, there are different cultural issues. You think about food culture, think about things like halal meat and so on. There are different requirements in different markets for meat products. In terms of offal products, in the UK, there is very little market for them these days, whereas there is a UK company based up in Scotland who exports 95% of their offal to Vietnam because every part of the animal is used. So everything can seem the same because we have a global aspect now with international trade, but locally it can be very, very different. On the left-hand side there, you see a picture which I took from the 27th floor of a hotel I was staying in Hong Kong, looking down on a bamboo balcony where a guy had been drinking a cup of tea just a few minutes before I took the photograph. Bamboo is a major form of scaffolding in Southeast Asia. It's commonly used even on the tallest buildings, but we wouldn't use it here in the UK and it wouldn't be used in the USA. So that's a physical difference in the way a market works. Also look at the business culture. What are the expected payment terms? In Europe, in theory, public sector companies are supposed to pay within 60 days. Whether that happens practically or not is another thing. But as a general rule of thumb, Northern Europe will pay much quicker than Southern Europe. But look at the differences between the markets. Do your research. Moving on. It really is vital that you support your market. And I've listed a whole range of ways that you can do that, but perhaps the most important one is, if you move on to the next slide, please, is to visit the market. If you do not have face-to-face interaction with many of your overseas selling partners, then they will probably go elsewhere to competitors who are prepared to put that level of effort into building a bond of trust. It's vital. People do business with people. And unless you understand that, then you will struggle to understand the process of international trade. You can supplement face-to-face with Skype meetings, with email marketing, with social media interactions, and you can get different people involved from your business in connecting with your selling partners in order to keep your brand name right in front of them. You can have, for example, your technical department liaising with them on fire regulations. You can have your customer services departments sending them sales leads. You don't have to do all of that. And then you can also, as well as visiting the market, you can invite your selling partners into your factory or office in your host country to give them training sessions, to take them through what's expected of them. And you can have seminars of all of your selling partners, as I've done several times in German exhibitions. Most of your selling partners will go to the exhibitions, and that's a great way of meeting everybody in one place. That's one of your market visits, effectively. Make sure also that you use your market visits to select customers that you want to go and see, not that what your selling partner wants to go and see. You are in control. You go and see them. They come along. That way you see their relationship with the customer. The customer sees that you're supporting the selling partner locally. Everybody wins from that situation. You have to put that effort in. Coming back to that point on the 7 fundamentals, it requires a budget. So you need to budget for international trade. Moving on. It's useful always to analyze your competition. However you do it, I've suggested a SWOT analysis there. So what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of your competition? Learn what their gaps are so that you can exploit them. Who are their key customers? That gives you a target of who to go after. Who are their selling partners? Are their selling partners happy? Are they unhappy? Can they be approached to sell your products? There are a lot of different issues there. Moving on. And back to that, the money thing. It's so important. You do have to speculate to accumulate. You've got all those costs that I've listed there, and they are going to cost you, and it will be an upfront cost until you can get some return on your investment. But unless you invest, you will not get a return. It's quite simple. It's a very simple equation. Forecasting, take a look at what forecasting may include. That's not just about sales figures, it's about how much it's going to cost to put together your marketing material, how much it's going to cost to achieve the right technical standards, how much it will be to appoint a solicitor both within your host country, and in the case of the USA, we generally advise that you have a locally based solicitor as well, based in the USA, because they know their system far better than we would do from over here. But think of all those costs, because you're going to have to cover them all. Moving on. This is just a very, very simple illustration of how I worked with a Paris distributor. He was a very, very good distributor, and he told me when I first met him back in 1989 or whenever it was, a bit later than that, that he could cover the whole country without a problem. And we weren't getting any sales from the south of France. So with his cooperation, we looked for a suitable agent for the south of France, and I appointed that agent directly. The result of that was that they started talking to each other and sharing other opportunities, so everybody won there too. But it's about relationships, about getting out there and seeing the market, and not accepting second best. That's the other thing. If there's a gap in the market, fill it. It's your job to do that. It's your distributor will want every piece of business they can get from the market. But if they're not doing it in a certain area, you need to fill that. Moving on. There's various ways of managing and motivating your selling partners. Selling partners in France and Germany are generally apportioned by postcode, especially sales agents. That's how they run their territories. And in a lot of cases, that will be fairly clear, and they will tell you what areas they cover. I've used project registration processes before now, project logging systems where there's long-term construction projects and everybody wants a slice of the pie. And you may have 3 agents in the same market, all aiming at the same projects. In that case, they have to prove to you how close they are to the project. So you have to have a checklist of what you want from them, and when they fill all the checklists, then you can say to them, yeah, okay, we will register that project under you. Then you protect it for them so that they're the main go-to person for that project in that market. It's important because it also shows that your loyalty only goes so far, but if they give you good information back, then you will support them in winning that project. We talked about market segmentation previously, so I won't go over that at this stage. Next slide, please. Incentivizing your overseas selling partners is not just about giving them money. You meet somebody at an exhibition, they want exclusivity tomorrow. You can't give it to them. That's like giving away your family silver. You must not do that. Exclusivity has to be earned. I've given exclusivity to 3 companies in 35 years. Don't let them have it. Make them work for it. If they're really, really, really good, then that's when they achieve exclusivity. Other than that, you can improve their payment terms. So you start on payment up front and you build to payment, a certain amount of payment on open account. You can give them better trading currencies. So rather than buying from you in UK pounds, you can buy in the local currency or dollars or euros, in which case your company needs to set up a euro or dollar account. You can improve the Incoterms, the transport terms that they use. So instead of having to collect from your warehouse, you're delivering it to them. So that's all your responsibility after that. Look at the contractual status. I've talked about exclusivity. I'm going to leave all the contractual stuff to Liz because she's expert in that side of things. But you'll probably start with a non-exclusive relationship, and that may build to a sole relationship for a market. And sole means that you're selling through that person as the only representative in that market, but it still entitles you to sell directly into major projects in that market. You can also second some of your own staff. If somebody's doing really well, but they need a little bit of extra resource, then send somebody over. Send another salesperson or technical person over in their support. And then there's the usual traditional incentives such as rebates and other performance-based incentives. These are all things that will enable you to incrementally to build the strength of your relationship with your selling partners. Moving on. Things to look out for. A distributor should distribute. They should hold stock, get them to commit to that at the first stage, get them to commit to a minimum quantity, stock holding and reorder point. Make sure you know how they're operating at all times so that you can monitor that kind of thing. I went to a distributor in Moscow, 2002, I think it would have been, and they wouldn't let me go to their warehouse when I asked, and so I was there for 4 days, and on the 4th day I went, and I found that half of their warehouse was full of a competitor's product. We sorted it out, but it's what you don't see, you don't know. Make sure you're asking questions and make sure that if you suspect anything, you go and investigate it. A sales agent, by definition, should focus on selling. That's what you want. You want their customers. And for them giving you their customers, you're giving them a commission. So make sure it's a sales agent and not a marketing agent or a merchandiser. It's really, really important to do that. The guys you see in the photograph are some Canadian distributors I set up, and that's a very personal photograph because that's Derek and his mother, and we had a big meal together with my client who I'd set them up with, and we had a fantastic evening together. So it was about family, getting to know family, and again, strengthening the bond of trust between the two parties. Moving on. Finally, just before I talk a little bit about open to export, Liz is going to cover the contractual relationships. Liz and I have worked together for 15 years, and we pass each other customers, and hopefully she's as happy with my work as I have been with hers. 3 points here. Take time to appoint the right people. If you get the right people, then you have less issues when it comes to dismissing them, because you won't want to dismiss them. That was one of the questions asked in the lead up to this, and we may cover it again later. Take time to understand the definitions of legal status when it comes to contractual arrangements between you and your overseas partner. And finally, you can use legal status as a performance incentive as well. You know, if somebody's on a non-exclusive contract and they're doing really well for you, you can say, you know, if you achieve another 50,000 euros of business next year, we'll consider giving you the sole distributorship, for example. Moving on. And this final slide is really just to say thank you for listening. We are open to questioning later, but to encourage you to sign up for the Open to Export action plan and to take a look through the Open to Export website. I've been working with Open to Export now for 5 years, and when I was skeptical when I first started looking at it, so I decided to do the action plan and do a dummy action plan for my own business, and it taught me things that I was avoiding. So it's really, really important that you do that. Have a look at all the information links and so on. Now, without more ado, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague and good friend, Liz Ward, who will take over from this point, and we may speak again later.
Thanks, John. Good afternoon, everybody. Good to have you all online. I will just say this as we start off. I do not put a lot of information on slides, and the reason for that is because I want you to listen to what I've got to say, and I want you to ask questions, and I want you to think about what I'm going to say today, which is all about the legal aspect and how important it is in any kind of international trade deal. Next slide, please. That's me. That I've got 20 or so years advising clients in international trade. I set up Virtuoso Legal in 2007, and I now have a fantastic team of people around me. But one of our core things that we do is help people who are trading internationally. Moving swiftly on, next slide, please. Okay, the 7 fundamentals set out by John Reed. I really like John's slide, actually. And I think what I want to say here is the 7 fundamentals that John set out need to be in your business plan. And just to remind you what John said, first of all, he talked about you having an international sales strategy, and you can't beat having a plan. I know that from owning a business. You always really have to work to a plan, even if you don't stick to a plan. But if you don't have a plan, you don't actually know where you're going or how you're going to get there. So look at the routes that you use to market, which are the most appropriate for you. That's got to be enshrined in your business plan. What are the traditional ways of doing business? There's no doubt about it. In some markets, online works well, and in other markets, it's got to be face-to-face type arrangements. Have a look at what your competitors are doing. Again, that's got to be in your business plan, and decide how frequently you want to go there. And these need to be reflected, these values need to be reflected in the legal documents that you put forward and propose as and when you've identified exactly who it is you want to do business with and how you want to do business with them. And why are the legals important? Well, the legals are important and the right lawyers are important because overseas trade is inherently risky. And what lawyers are there to do is to de-risk it as much as possible. Next slide, please. So what do I mean by this? A lot of people think of a lawyer as being somebody that you go to when you've done the deal. I would suggest otherwise. I would suggest that very much as I over the years have found to choose all kinds of expert advisors, whether they're accountants or whoever they are, the right professional will add value by understanding what it is you want to achieve and doing that early. One of the things that we do very often with clients, whether it's international trade or UK trade, is we sit down with them and we go through what they want to achieve in their legal agreements and what they want to achieve in their business. It's really important to take a holistic view of a company and say, where do you want to be? How are we going to get there? What are we going to do to go and get there? And the right lawyer will help you by not just posing those slightly challenging questions, but also helping you go through things like checklists and negotiations. Again, if it's your first foray into an overseas agreement, it might be the sort of thing that you need your hand holding with a little bit. On the other hand, if you've done it lots of times, you might go back to your regular lawyer and say, look, let's go through this checklist. What do we think is going to be important in this jurisdiction? And you go off and you negotiate it all on your own. And how are things de-risked? Well, one of the key things, of course, if you're doing international trade is you want to make sure that you actually get paid. And there's all sorts of ways around defaulting on payments and international payments. So that's a very core part of what you want to achieve. You want to avoid problems in overseas markets. So you want to be abundantly clear who's doing what, who's responsible for local legislation, who's responsible for insuring and transport and that kind of thing. Another way of thinking about it too is making sure that your goods are going to be sold exactly as their specification. And I'll give you an example of this. It happened to me quite a few years ago now. I was acting for a manufacturer who made pumps of all things. And they were dealing with a Malaysian market. And they found that the distributor over there was cutting costs by putting some cheap components, flexible piping into these pipes, into these pumps, and they were then exploding. So you can imagine the kind of ramifications of doing that. So these are all sorts of things that you can slightly de-risk by having the right legal agreements in place, and also thinking about these things before they happen, thinking about who's going to be responsible for what. Next slide, please. So you need to discuss what different opportunities you've got with your solicitor, with a specialist solicitor, before you go overseas. There's a whole host of ways of doing trade, directly or indirectly, and John has touched on a few of those. But I mean, for example, agents are a great idea. And if you're looking at somewhere like a developed country such as Australia or the EU or the USA, it's a relatively risk-free way of doing international trade. You appoint your distributor, you appoint your agent, he takes orders on your behalf in very broad terms, and the customer pays you. All very well, but not great in some countries where agency arrangements can be caught by local laws. They have to be registered at a local court, and there can be all sorts of issues that arise out of that. A distribution agreement, which again, we've kind of looked at that, John's looked at it. Your distributor, are they going to hold stock? How are they going to cooperate with you? What sort of stock levels are they going to have? What sort of potential have they got? These are the kind of questions you might well be asking, and those are the kind of points that are going to want to go into some kind of a legal agreement. And increasingly, of course, international sales these days are actually done directly. So you may well be fulfilling orders into overseas markets. Now, one of the big problems with overseas markets, as I'm going to touch on later, is ensuring that the products that you've got are compliant with local laws. Because not everybody has the same standards. Not everybody has the same safety standards. Not every consumer has the same requirements. Some of them quite definitely don't want to think about other things, that other products and things like that that will go with it, or ingredients, etc. Next slide. So it's really important to know your local market. Inside the European Union, if you don't have a proper agency agreement, then that is some kind of madness. The European agency regulations mean that if you want to terminate an EU agent and you don't have a proper agreement in place, you have to pay them sometimes up to 3 years worth of commissions that they would have expected. So very important that you get a proper written agreement, particularly in the EU. If you're going to appoint an agent in, say, for example, Australia or the USA, you again would have to look very carefully at what local laws apply, and we probably suggest in those instances that you get an agency agreement run by a local lawyer to make sure that it operates and it works properly in those jurisdictions, that you can get rid of people if they don't perform, you can get rid of people if they start selling competitor products, or they start trading in a way that you don't approve of. For example, making all kinds of promises on your products or services that can't be delivered. I'm going to tell you a little story here about the Middle East. I, many years ago, acted for a household name. Sadly, they are no longer trading, but they had set up in the free trade zone in Dubai, I think it was, operating under, it was sort of like a quasi-agency arrangement. And there was a bit of a fallout, and we found that, in fact, out in the Middle East, the agency agreement they had been registered at a local court out in Dubai, and we then had to unpick all that. It was messy, it was awful, but it was something that they'd done internally. They hadn't taken external advice. It took a great deal of effort to unpick it. I had another client a few years ago who sold air conditioning out in the Middle East, again a very big market, and they appointed their agent out there. They then found themselves utterly tied into a long-term agreement with this agent, who was in fact selling not only their air conditioning systems, but he was selling a competitor's air conditioning systems. And again, the agency agreement had been registered locally. It was very difficult to unpick, and I think it was about 5 years before they could appoint a competitor in that locality. So do be aware of agency agreements, particularly in the Middle East. Franchising, again, very popular way of doing business. Franchising and licensing, very popular way of doing business in a lot of the developed world, works extremely well in places like the USA and Australia, but less so in some other jurisdictions. Finally, on to local consumer laws, because these can be very important. Next slide, please. A couple of examples here that I've come across actually in the last couple of years. One of my clients makes helmets, ski helmets, bike helmets, protective headwear, and they have moved from the market in the EU out into the USA, and they found that they got a whole different safety standard to apply to their products in the USA, and they had to fairly rigorously test all the helmets that they produced to make sure that they complied with local legislation. And of course they had to get, because they were selling them directly, they had to get product insurance, product liability insurance and so on to cover the US market. The second rather yummy looking picture is of some wonderful looking jellies, and again foodstuffs. Great opportunity for UK producers to export food. UK food is in very high demand in a lot of countries. There are some fantastic opportunities out in places like China and Vietnam, as John's already mentioned, because UK products, UK foodstuffs are seen as, quite rightly seen, as having a very high standard, as being good quality products. But do be aware that some things cannot be sold into different markets. The obvious one is things like gelatine. You've got to be a little bit careful about animal products and so on, particularly into foodstuffs like sweets, biscuits and so on. But I had a client recently who in fact made some wonderful jams and jellies and things, and she was putting these were aimed at the adult market, but she was putting alcohol into some of these jams and jellies, which is great for the EU, which is where she sold most of them. But then she had problems obviously when she wanted to export to the Middle East, which was a big market. So she did a specific range that could be easily exported to the UAE and elsewhere. So do be careful, not just about legislation, but also about what people actually want from the products that you're selling. Next slide, please. One of the big questions is, I think, getting into a legal agreement with anybody either in the UK or indeed in an overseas market where the risks are even higher, it's all about choosing the right person to do business with. And I think John would echo this. It really pays to do a little bit of work here. If you're going to, say, for example, a trade event, have a chat with the people who are at the trade event of what they think about different people. How do they do business? It's also possible to ask your accountant and your lawyer to do some simple checks on those people. For example, credit searches, simple company searches. Many companies are online these days, but it's worthwhile getting a local agent in some instances to have a look at what, for example, what money the company's got in the bank, how long they've been trading, who the directors are, this kind of thing. Also worthwhile finding out whether or not they sell competitor products, because you do not want to get into a position where they're selling a direct competitor. Ask about payment terms before you move forward into a legal agreement. I had a client a few years ago, it must be about 5 or 6 years ago now, who'd started selling into Spain and Portugal and was selling a lot of product. It was a medical product into those markets, but then found out that they weren't getting paid for at least 120 days. Now, okay, it was a national health service type arrangements that they got, so they knew ultimately that they were getting paid. What they didn't really understand was just how long it was going to take for them to get paid. So effectively, they were bankrolling those products into that market for months before they were paid for them. One of the other issues that can arise with getting paid is local currency restrictions. Some countries don't allow certain amounts of more than certain amounts of money to go out of the country, or different restrictions. For example, getting goods sold into somewhere like Iran is fine, but actually getting paid for them can be very difficult, particularly in US dollars, and this is one of the big dilemmas at the moment in relation to Iran. Next page, please. Next slide. This is something that's very dear to my heart because I've seen so many people get it wrong. If you've got your intellectual property, if, for example, you've got a brand, you've got a fantastic brand, you've got a fantastic design right, you've brought out the latest toy, you've brought out the latest snazzy looking leather satchel or whatever it is, you must get your brand rights, your design rights, or your patents and technology registered locally. Throughout the EU, you can get things like a European trademark, a European design right, but to protect your marks, you must have a local registration. And it must be in your name too. I've seen all sorts of horrendous things happen. For example, people go to South America and say to their agent out there or their distributor, this is great, we want to bring this out and you can distribute it. Before they know it, the local agent has registered the trademark. I had one quite big company who mistakenly jointly registered their brands out in the Southeast Asian market using joint ownership. So they owned it and their distributor also owned the mark. So it was joint ownership, which was fine until they fell out with the distributor, and then they couldn't effectively get their market back without rebranding. So that's an extremely expensive mistake. So please don't do that. And if you have got a great brand, if you have got a great design right, then please do register it. It's quite straightforward and it's probably not as expensive as you think. And there's all sorts of clever ways around getting international registrations too that will save you some money. So again, ask a specialist and make sure that you've got that point covered off before you actually release or discuss things in the local market. Next slide, please. So these are key considerations to go in any legal agreement, whether it's an agency agreement, distribution agreement, however it is, white labeling agreement. There's all sorts of ways of getting to market. But one of the issues is if you're going to generate leads and sales, well, who is going to own those in your local market? Are you going to generate leads online from the UK and then be satisfied locally by a distribution agreement, or how is that going to work? Who's going to be compliant with the local laws? So are you going to ask your distributor to make sure that your products are fit for purpose in the locality in which they're sold, or are you going to do it? What kind of sales restrictions are you going to apply to those people? So, for example, are you going to put strict territorial limits on where they can supply goods or which customers they can go and see? These are all things for consideration. Also, what happens if your relationship with the distributor or the agent doesn't work out? How long are you going to be tied into it, and how are you going to walk away from that? Are you going to buy stock back? Are you going to allow them a period to sell off? How quickly can you appoint another distributor in a locality? John's made a very, very good point about exclusivity, it comes with a big warning sign on, does it? Exclusivity. It's got to be earned, earned not just in terms of trust, but also in terms of financial rewards for you as supplier. And how are you going to get paid? And when are you going to get paid? Are you going to get money up front from people? Is it a big project? Are you going to get paid partway through the completion of the contract? Are you going to get paid when the goods arrive at their factory gates or at the warehouse, wherever? These are things that you need to consider. Next slide, please. Again, it's worthwhile enshrining in a legal document how are you going to work together. Are you both going to be responsible, for example, for going to extremely expensive trade fairs in a particular country? Are you going to set minimum performance criteria for them? Or are you going to say to them again, well, you need to be ordering so much every 6 months or so much every 3 months? What insurance do you need? Again, insurance is something that's often overlooked until it's needed. Not just insuring the goods as they're shipped, but also insuring things like bad debts, insuring things going wrong. How are you going to cover the shipping of your goods? That's something that John brought up in relation to Incoterms. These are standard terms that exporters use, and they vary quite widely, but again, it's worthwhile thinking about, is the other party going to be responsible for something as and when it enters their country, as and when it's at their factory gate? How is it going to be paid for and shipped? And again, it's worthwhile, if you're working with a bigger organization, to have designated individuals that you are going to work with, and those people can be named in agreements, and indeed, if you like, a basis on which disagreements can be escalated up the management scale. That's all food for thought for a legal agreement. And finally, territories. Which territories is the agreement going to cover? Because that is increasingly blurred in the day and age of online sales. So you have a lot of things to think about with your professional advisor, and it is best done before you've gone into that market, or when you're in negotiations with somebody. Before you've shaken hands on everything, think about the terms that you need in a contract. Next slide, please. So what should you have in your legal budget? Well, the cost of registering your intellectual property locally, that should be number one. The value of your contract. I know one of the questions was about template contracts. Well, use them at your risk. They are one size that never fits anybody. And I would say to you this: if you want a rule of thumb, then the higher the value of the contract to you, or the bigger the potential spend for you, then I would say it needs a higher legal spend in your head, or a higher budget for legal spend. Again, something else that you might want to factor into your budget is insurance for getting paid, or insurance against being sued. And that's particularly important in some countries such as the USA. Again, as part of your legal budget, you might want to think of the cost of compliance. I hate to think of what my clients spent on testing helmets for the US market, but I know it was a considerable amount of money. And again, with products that go into the construction market, you may well need to spend quite a lot of money on getting local testing done and certificates and so on. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, it's a great opportunity to export, and there's never been a better time to export. I think it's amazing, really. I'm disappointed about Brexit, but I'm also excited about Brexit, because I think there are opportunities there for ambitious companies to go and export, and I think that we're very poor at doing that in the UK. So we're in quite exciting times, really. But don't lose sight of the risk, and make sure you've done your homework on all this. And that helps you, having a proper plan helps you focus on the task at hand. Last slide, please. Thanks very much for listening. I think there may well be some questions now, but my assistant Martin also is scheduling appointments if you want to have a quick free 20-minute phone call with me sometime over the next couple of weeks if you need further help. So over to you, Will. Over to you, John.
Many thanks, Liz and John. Lots of really great advice as always there, and hopefully that's been useful for what is always a popular topic. We're a little bit short on time, so we're only going to do a couple of questions today. The first one I'm going to put to John first. It's from Anwar, and it's: how can I meet with international potential clients or start discussions if they do not respond to phone calls or emails? John.
Well, the answer, Anwar, is quite simple. Well, there's two answers. One, they may not want to talk to you, but two, be persistent. The guy I showed you, Derek, and his mum in the photograph in the earlier slide, I phoned Derek every single day at the same time for 14 days before he picked up my call. I left answer phone messages after answer phone messages. I knew he needed my product. He kind of knew it, but we hadn't had the conversation. I also knew how good he was from somebody else he sold through. You have to keep going. You have to find ways of being introduced, sometimes via a third party, by another company who's already connected with them. They may be at a trade show where you can get an introduction, or an industry seminar. And sometimes, frankly, it's just a personal thing. They don't want to talk to you. And I've had occasions, not many, I hasten to add, but I have had occasions where I've sent in a colleague to win an order that I've been trying to win for years, and they've got it on the day. So it can be a very personal thing. It can be about timing. And in a lot of cases, especially in the fashion industry, think about that. If you approach a client at the wrong time, if you approach a designer at the wrong time, they're not going to answer your questions. Get the timing right. Same with architects. They're not going to talk to you if the deal's already done, and they're not going to talk to you if it's not relevant timing for them at that time.
Great, thank you. And the second question I was going to ask is from Mike, and it's: when's the right time to fire a representative or distributor, and should you overdo it? I'm going to put that first to John and then open it to Liz as well.
My quick answer to that has already been given, really. Make sure you appoint the right people so that you don't have to fire them, is the first one. But if you do find yourself in a position where you have to fire a selling partner, then make sure it's on your terms. Don't fire them in the middle of a big contract or something like that. Don't do anything that's going to affect your business. Make sure you've got a replacement before you fire them. Make sure you've got contingency plan in place. Those are really the key things. You should only really fire somebody if they've been involved in corrupt or illegal practice, and I'm sure Liz will throw some light on that now.
Well, I'd say read your contract before you fire them, because that's the start point for getting rid of anybody. But people do start to underperform. A few years ago, I had a client who was in the wine trade and had a very successful agent in France, but as the guy got older, he just wasn't doing as much business. He was winding down, and we wanted to get rid of him, but sadly there was no contract in place, and my client ended up paying him some compensation, really, to retire.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm going to do one last question if John's still there. It was a really last minute question just come through. It's from Abiola, and she asked, what kind of support do you think is best to provide agents and support and distributors, and how much support should you give?
I think it varies. Only you will know, because it's about who you appoint and what they demand. I had a guy in Chile once who was demanding that we sent over all our samples, that we visited and trained his staff. We attended the trade show exhibitions. They wanted us to do everything, and that's not a partnership. What you have to establish is a partnership, so that your responsibilities are clearly defined in a contract, as Liz has just been talking about, so that everybody knows what is available. In the end, I told the guy that I wasn't working with him. And when you take that stance, then they either come back and say, look, can we renegotiate, or they throw the dummy out of the pram. And it depends how much you value them. If they're already in place and they're making demands that seem unreasonable, they may also have a good point because they know their local market better than you. And the only way you're going to be able to substantiate that is by visiting the market and finding out.
Yeah,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile finding out what their expectations are before you go into that, get into a business relationship with them, and to set out a clear marketing plan and to have that incorporated into your agreement with them.
Great.
Agreed.
Well, thank you, Liz and John. We're at 3 o'clock now, so I think we're gonna have to wrap up. As I've mentioned on the question chat, we will be able to look at a few of these extra questions offline afterwards. But I hope everyone found that useful, and thank you once again to Liz and John.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
So the summer is closing, coming to its close, and as is often the way, there's plenty for you to be aware of in terms of what's coming up in the autumn. There's the Queen's Awards for Enterprise, a prestigious annual award for UK businesses, which could see your business gain worldwide recognition and be invited to a fabulous royal reception next summer. The deadline to enter that is September 12th. The Institute of Export and International Trade are taking their World Trade Summit programme to the Northwest for the first time on September 19th, and that's in Liverpool. There'll be a great lineup of speakers there, and that's also a great networking opportunity for exporters and trade professionals alike. You can find out registration info at export.org.uk/events. And the Institute is also running a day-long workshop in London with Corporate Catalyst India this September, guiding businesses through the challenges of selling into India. More information about that course can be found on export.org.uk/training. There are now just a couple more weeks left for companies from anywhere in the world to enter the Open to Export International Business Awards, a competition we're running this summer with the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as part of their Small Business Champions initiative. This is a great chance for SMEs to win $5,000 towards your export action plans, and the final will be taking place in Geneva in October as part of the WTO's public forum. More information about that can be found at opentoexport.com/international business awards. Finally, we have 2 further webinars coming up in the next couple of weeks. The first is on the importance of learning the skills for international trade and opportunities to do so. That session is on August 28th. And after that, we're being joined again by Bibby Financial Services, who will be guiding new exporters through the ways in which they can overcome the funding challenges of entering international trade. And that would be on September 5th. Again, more details can be found about those on opentoexport.com/webinars. As always, please do take our exit survey as you leave to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give any suggestions for improvements or future topics. Apologies for slightly overrunning, but I hope you found that all useful today. So goodbye for now.